Hello my friends, Stucky here, and welcome back to another Alternate History Hearts of Iron 4 video. Yeah, you're probably surprised seeing this up right now. I'm sure that a number of you watching right now are confused as to why the World War I mod, Great War Redux, is up, when if you go back and look at the poll results, it should have been Equestria War. What if Stucky told the alternate history of Equestria War? I'm gonna do this, guys, I am, but I realized over the course of seeing the results of that poll that oh dear God, that means I have to actually learn the entire history of Equestria War and actually study the lore extensively. And that is a major undertaking that as a historian, I'm not really familiar with. So congratulations to all you bronies out there. You have made me not just have to passively learn things, I now have to do a deep dive into pony lore. So thank you. In the meantime, while it is that I'm learning that, we are going to go ahead and go with the second place option. What if the Netherlands joined World War I? Which the comment that had suggested that said that I could choose whatever side I wanted based off the realism of it. And I think that's exactly how it is that we're going to explain things. Because realistically speaking, yeah, the Netherlands could have done multiple things. Yeah, but there's definitely a more likely answer in all of this that a lot of people are not necessarily prepared for. Also, the commenter in here who wrote the history of my wife's Sim4 save file. That's not safe for YouTube, buddy. Oh my God, she just said in the background that I could give a brief history. Gabby, no, please control yourself. Well, we may not have any control over that, but you know what we do have control over? Our finances. With today's sponsor, Rocket Money. Yeah, you see what I did there? For those of you who are not aware of what Rocket Money is, you really need to check this out. This is a service that I have been using personally for many years, ever since it was something called Truebill. It is a personal finance app that will help you to cancel unwanted subscriptions, lower your bills, make a custom budget, all in one place. Considering how many family members that I have that are utilizing different subscriptions that I am tied to, I have this habit of signing up to free trials for things and then subsequently forgetting about it, which ends up proving rather painful later. And thanks to things like Rocket Money, I'm able to connect my bank account and then from there automatically go through all the subscriptions that I have and cancel the ones that I don't need. And the savings from this can be massive. Rocket Money has helped to save its customers up to $740 a year when you use all the app's premium features. They've also helped customers save over $880 million in canceled subscriptions alone. You and I both know here, my friends, that in today's day and age in the economy, it is getting increasingly more difficult for many people to make ends meet. There's no reason that someone should not take control of their finances and know what it is that they are doing with their life. So by all means, take control of your finances today. Go and click my link down in the description or scan the QR code that you can see up here. And from that, you can sign up for a free trial with Rocket Money, joining the over 10 million users it already has. Thank you very much for Rocket Money for sponsoring this episode, and now back to the show. Anyway, by this point, you all know how it works. I take the top liked suggestions down in the comment section, and I slap that into a poll to determine the next video. In this case, because it is that I'm going to have to combine from two different videos, since the next one after this is going to need to be the Equestria War one, since I just need a little bit more time on that, I'm only going to be taking the top 2 like suggestions from this, and I will be taking then the top like suggestions from the Equestria video, and then submitting that as well, so we're going to try and get back on track. So for you first watchers, go ahead and submit your comment right now. It means it's far more likely to go ahead and get chosen. Anyway, Great War Redux mod. We are launching right here into the beginning of World War I, or specifically 1914, and we are using Great War Redux because it actually has a focus tree for the Netherlands. Since the Hague Conference in 1907, the Netherlands has had to do everything to avoid political alliance with another European empire, as the drums of war resound at the gates of Amsterdam, and despite their strong policy of neutrality, the peaceful mill country could soon find itself against the wall, having to make a choice that could forever change the future of the Dutch Empire. No one knows how the fiercely patriotic Queen Wilhelmina will react. Yes, because if we go and launch things here in 1910, we actually have a variety of choices that we can make in comparison to the base World War I mod. There's actual alternate history that can be chosen, but realistically, things for the Netherlands could only really work one way. And no, I'm not talking about neutrality. Yeah, there are multiple ways that things could have gone down, but if we look at the historical reality of the way that the Netherlands was over the course of the early 1900s, heading all the way into World War I, the majority of the Netherlands was not pro-German, it was pro-Allies. It was pro-UK and France, with specifically Wilhelmina actually being, well, very pro-French and Belgian herself. She wanted to go and support the Allies, even though her husband was in fact a German who was very pro-German, very publicly pro-German. Even though Wilhelmina was pro-Allies, she, in the public, had to be neutral. In fact, I actually think her husband's nephew, so not her nephew necessarily, but his nephew by another relation, was even in the German army. It's something that the state of the Netherlands was very split, with some people being pro-German, some people being pro-Entente, and ultimately, the Netherlands would end up choosing to be neutral. But there is a great argument that one can make that if a couple things were different, that the Netherlands would have actually gone and supported the Entente. Now, I know in most scenarios when we're going and describing this, a lot of people say, oh, well, what if the Netherlands had joined the Central Powers? And yes, while technically speaking, this could have happened, it is a far riskier and less likely move unless we go back and change a lot of things in history in order to make that possible. The Netherlands, over the course of pretty much the entirety of the late 1800s heading into the early 1900s, was focused on maintaining their empire. They had their little colonies down here in South America, so Suriname, and of course the crown jewel of the overall colonies was Indonesia, which they had to protect at all costs. Here's the thing. When people say, oh, well, what if the Netherlands had joined the Central Powers? That would have given the Japanese free rein to invade. The entire reason why Japan immediately signed up with the Entente in order to attack the Central Powers is because it was basically a free war for them in which they could lose no men whatsoever, really, and yet still be able to take the German colonies that they had here, such as Yatsenthal here, which is owned by the German Empire. The Japanese went and launched an invasion here. They also went and invaded, Micronesia, I think is what it is. It's all the little colonies that you see here of the Germans. The Japanese went and seized these. If the Dutch had sided with the Central Powers, then there would have been basically no forces over here to be able to defend against the Japanese. And the Dutch were already having to deal with a number of different separatist issues, which meant that no one among the local population would have really supported them. We can make an argument, many different arguments, about how that could be theoretically different if, say, as example, the Japanese did not join in on the war. But it was pretty much a free thing for them to do this. There's no reason for them to necessarily not. We'd have to change a lot more factors in history in order to be able to make that possible. As such, the most realistic answer is that the Dutch end up actually siding with the Entente if a couple other circumstances change, which we're going to go ahead and explain. To begin then here, my friends, in 1910, we need to kind of explain how Dutch neutrality as a concept worked. It's different from Belgium as well as other states, which were actually guaranteed and backed by other powers. Dutch neutrality in this time was something that was unilateral. The Dutch would constantly declare neutrality over the course of the beginning of World War I for Germany, France, Belgium, Austria-Hungary. As every single power declared war on one another, each time one of those declarations would happen, the Dutch would declare their neutrality. And by serving as a kind of gate between the powers, it was something that would constantly have its army mobilized in an effort to be able to discourage Germany or France or the UK from launching their own invasion into it to try and gain an edge over their enemy. Essentially, the Netherlands with their royal army acted in a similar way to what Switzerland would over the course of World War II. So how do we change things then? Well, the first course of action for the Netherlands is to change what we are going to be doing with our economy. The Netherlands during this time is a very citizen-centered economy, and we need to say that in this time, considering the rising tensions that are seen within Europe, that perhaps the Netherlands takes a more proactive approach, thinking that if conflict breaks out, they need to be prepared. As such, the reorganization of production occurs as more factories are geared towards perhaps modernizing and updating and creating larger supply and resources for the military so it is better prepared. Thus, the citizen-centered economy is removed. What this means, my friends, is that we don't really have to change anything with the Dutch economy or how it works necessarily right now in comparison to what we've had to do for other videos. The Netherlands isn't suddenly going to get significantly more infrastructure. They're not going to get more gold. They're not going to get more factories. They're not going to get more. They're going to be dealing with pretty much the exact same resources that they had in our own time at the beginning of the war, or I say at the beginning of the prelude to the war. What we will arguably say is that perhaps more British investment, more French investment comes into the Netherlands, and this is something that does give the economy a boost, but it is also something that ties the economy of the Netherlands closer to the UK and France than it does to Germany, thus propping it up a little bit better. In fact, by that logic, we're just going to do a very simple thing. We're going to do IC, we're going to give a single civilian factory, and we are also going to give a single military factory. That is it. That is all that we are going to do. Perhaps then, because of closer relations and potentially more security guarantees, the Dutch don't have to focus nearly as much on their navy as they had in our own time. The Dutch navy was actually pretty decent, and so we can say that perhaps instead of diverting more resources towards the navy, maybe the merchant marine is still something that is developed, but at the same time, more money is reserved for the land armed forces. So it is here, my friends, over the course of 1910, heading into 1911, that I realized that I need to make a little bit of a change. I said before that we weren't really going to be doing anything to change how things work historically, but in order for this scenario to work, it means that there already needs to be a greater sympathy for England that has developed over the course of the previous years. See, one of the big things that turned a decent amount of the Dutch population against the British in the first place is the Boer War, the Second Boer War, which occurred then from, 1899 all the way through 1901? No, 1902. It was 1902. And then over the course of that conflict, and because of what was done with the Dutch Boer settlers, it turned a decent amount of the Dutch population against the British. We could arguably say that, hey, what if maybe the Boer War wasn't as bad, right? Maybe this was something that perhaps there weren't as many internment camps. I don't know. We can say that maybe the conflict was over quicker, so there was less hard feelings that developed. It still likely took place, but maybe instead of it ending in 1902, it ended in the beginning of 1901, so it was shorter. Either way, the result is the same. Yes, Dutch neutrality is still a thing, but the Netherlands is the gateway to Europe, and there is a greater degree of sympathy for England already. So because of these greater sympathies, and because perhaps of greater investment within the Netherlands, a series of trade privileges are granted to the UK, and then subsequently after that to France. Minor concessions are, of course, granted to Germany, because this is something that is going to happen, lest it turns Germany against it entirely, but a greater degree of privileges are still going to be granted to the UK. Now, one of the big questions that people are going to have heading into 1911 is what exactly is going to happen politically? Because, of course, we're saying that the Netherlands is going to be siding with the Entente and the Allies, right? Like, that's going to happen. But what does that mean that they're going to do on the political spectrum? Do they go more socialist? Do they go more monarchist? Do they go more liberal? And the answer is that they are going to do the historical thing of going down the liberal path, but that's not necessarily going to happen immediately. The Netherlands ended up getting a new administration over the course of 1913, and that one lasted all the way until 1918, which was remarkably long for a lot of Dutch governments. But what we are going to say here is that this is not something that takes place earlier. The election for the Netherlands is something that happens in June of 1913, and we will say that exactly that still takes place. So we are not going to beeline down a political path here and boost everything up this way, because it wouldn't really make sense. Instead, we're going to say that the Dutch during the initial years from 1911, 1912, heading into 1913, largely focus on their own economy, beginning early stages of modernization and build up the military, as well as support and heavy investment that goes into the colonies. Because of the amount of investment that is going to be taking place within the colonies of the Netherlands, they are not going to want to lose this. And we can arguably say that more investment came from Britain and France here, so they're going to be even more closely tied than they otherwise would have been. From all these investments that are taking place, it means that the Dutch are going to have more money to be able to invest into their military, which means one of the first things that is going to be done is that the military staff is going to be reformed and reorganized, and at the same time, new officers are going to go through their exams, which means that the Dutch are going to have a greater understanding of modern warfare, considering that they haven't been involved in a conflict since really the revolution that broke out Belgium back in the 1830s. Or is that 20s? Early 1800s. And there we have the Agadir crisis, the thing between France and Germany over their claims in Morocco. Now, again, we can say in this that the Netherlands is still neutral, though they lean more towards supporting France in this time. That doesn't necessarily really mean anything per se, but we could arguably say that the Germans were even more provocative in this time than they otherwise were, and that is something that maybe moved more of the Dutch public in favor of the Entente. Perhaps it actually is that after the Agadir crisis, that enough political support exists to be able to begin to prepare the economy more for a potential conflict. This is where early mobilization will be able to take place, as more factories are perhaps prepared by the state to be able to prepare for armed conflict. In fact, subsidies are given for rearmament, something that is able to boost up the Dutch military a couple years before the conflict takes place. Now, naturally, over the course of 1912, heading into 1913, things are going to still be taking place exactly as they did in their own time. You have the Balkan War that is going to take place, followed by the Second Balkan War, and this is obviously not going to be a great thing down here, but it's not really going to affect the Netherlands, which instead is going to be largely focused internally, academically, and more importantly, militarily. The Lehman von Sanders affair began opposing Russian and German interests in the Bosphorus. Well, okay, that is... Wow, Redux actually added a lot more things in here now. So it is, my friends, then, that June of 1913 passes, which means that we have a new election. That means a new government is in charge. And actually, that means I'm going to replace... Nope, I can't replace Coolie labor in here. I need to replace that here. As soon as this is finished, we're going to be moving over and doing conservative liberalism, as we are going to say that the new cabinet comes and takes power. You are going to have Peter Cort van der Linden, who becomes in charge. And this is where things are going to rapidly change over the course of mid-1913, heading into mid-1914. Now, unfortunately, in order for me to be able to do this fast enough, we do have to kind of cheat here again. With focused autocomplete on, we will say we have conservative liberalism, we have a new cabinet. Mr. van der Linden has been appointed Prime Minister of the Netherlands, and he now has to form a liberal cabinet. We wish him good luck. And what we will say here is that the greater sympathies that you see within Dutch society results in the election of officials that are more pro-Entente. Historically, what had happened is that the Netherlands was quite split over, pro-Entente, pro-German, pro-just pure neutrality, etc. And ultimately, this ended up being played out as a purely neutral stance. But we can say that significantly less pro-German officials are elected into the Dutch government, meaning you're going to have more just pro-Entente and pro-neutral, but we can say that the pro-Entente side wins out. More than 25% will take... Okay, so we can't do the things immediately here, we will say, but okay. It's up to you, Peter von Santa-looking guy that is actually going to be the one that changes the course of human history as we know it. Either way, what it is that we can argue is that a greater degree of cooperation with the Commonwealth takes place. There's more investment into Dutch industry, there's more collaborations that take place perhaps between the Dutch military as well as the UK. Maybe as well this also happens with Germans in order to be able to keep a degree of neutrality still on the table, but largely it is mostly pro-Entente. And there we have it. Franz Ferdinand and his consort killed in Sarajevo, 1914. This is exactly the moment that we have been waiting for. So with this begins the July Crisis. Serbia naturally was of course going to refuse Austrian demands. This is the thing that kicks off World War I, and the question at this point is, does the Netherlands join in on the conflict immediately? No, even with the Netherlands siding more with the Entente, this is not going to happen because they're going to need time to prepare their military. They're going to need to be able to fortify the border. They're going to need to be able to try and maintain neutrality as long as possible. That is the most realistic answer in this. And the deciding factor for what is going to cause them to actually enter the conflict is likely going to be Belgium. As Germany goes and launches this invasion into Belgium, this is something that had created historically a very tense situation with the Dutch. So there is even a part here where they had launched their invasion in, where part of the road was owned by the Dutch and the other part was owned by Belgium. And Dutch soldiers had been stationed here specifically in order to be able to direct the Germans like, hey, this is the Belgian side of the road, this is ours, and they had declared their neutrality. Part of this issue was that the Entente did accuse the Netherlands of aiding the German invasion, etc., etc. But what we can say here in this time is that perhaps a violation took place in which maybe German soldiers fired on the Dutch guards that were at the border, or they took the Dutch roads in the first place, which is an incursion in Dutch territory and a violation of their sovereignty. Either way, this is something that is going to put the Netherlands firmly in the camp of the Entente, even before the horrors that would take place in Belgium, also called the... Well, I can't say the word here on YouTube, but just look up the colloquial name for the invasion of Belgium. It's non-consensual stuff, we will say the least. As this is done, the Netherlands would prepare its borders, becoming the fortress of the Benelux, so to speak. With more economic power, more investment, etc., this means that it would be able to invest a greater amount of resources in defenses to be able to guard its border in the first place. Yep, here it is, the event that I was talking about. Reports have come in describing the outright barbaric treatment of Belgian civilians by Germans, anticipating guerrilla attacks from Franktours who don't actually exist, German commanders have taken civilian hostages as they pass through towns and villages, then shoot the hostages in groups whenever German soldiers are killed. Blamed on shadow guerrillas, the usual stray bullets and friendly fire incidents have already resulted in hundreds of murdered Belgians, and for reasons that remain unclear, the historic city university of Louvain was burned. Just like looting and murder, something was widespread. This would cause an immense amount of outrage for the Dutch public. But their forces would not yet be prepared, especially since the Germans would be breaking into France itself at this point before eventually they are stopped. This is something to where the Dutch would not be in a position to be able to potentially counterattack, and instead droves upon droves of men would begin to pour into the army, signing up. Unfortunately for the Germans, though, even though they would make great inroads into France, and this would go exactly as it did in our own time, eventually, though, things would settle. They would fail to reach Paris, and instead, both sides would begin to settle into a state of trench warfare. Things, of course, would be far more fluid on the Eastern Front, but still, the loss of life, particularly in the beginning, would be truly horrifying. For the Netherlands, they would have to bide their time. Eventually, just like in the case of Italy, a full-blown alliance with the UK would be launched, but to do so in 1914, even after potentially years of preparation, would be practically suicidal. This is not something that they would be able to do on their own. It would require months of potential secret negotiations with security guarantees and forces being prepared to be launched from the UK, as this would take a decent amount of time to ship over. The entire time that this conflict is taking place, as 1950 rolls around, the Netherlands would not necessarily have cut off all trade to Germany, even if they are most certainly more pro-Entente. They would still be forced to trade to a degree with Germany, if only to be able to preserve their neutrality as long as possible. Because if they cease all German trade, then there is a decent chance that Germany would just go outright and invade it, and that is not something that they can really handle. So for the year, from the middle of 1914 to the middle of 1915, the Netherlands would be preparing the entire time, building up fortresses, supplying arms, building up its military as the men sign up in droves. All of these things would be taking place. No, in fact, the biggest thing that is going to take place, the deciding factor that is likely going to launch the Netherlands into the conflict, is specifically Italy siding with the Entente. It would make sense that what we would see is multilateral, is that the term that I would have here? Essentially, multiple rounds of secret negotiations are taking place in which both Italy and the Netherlands have been invited to a conference within the UK where both are promised support. The Italians are, of course, promised many gains within Austria, while it is that the UK would end up providing guarantees as well as support for the Netherlands should it join the conflict in order to try and break the stalemate. This is likely something that would have been heavily pushed by the Russians, as by this point heading into 1915, their front line was essentially collapsing. They were doing everything possible to try and stall things, but unless something changed on the Western Front, forcing the Germans to divert forces, the Russians were going to be in for a very bad time. As the Italians launched their invasion into Austria, this is the moment... Are you serious? It won't... You're ruining my story, game! Yeah, we gotta go ahead and fix this here real quick by doing some bullshit. The immediate result of this action would be absolute surprise as well as panic on behalf of the Central Powers. Yes, the Austrians would be able to deal with or hold the Italians, but for the Germans, having their attention split at such a crucial moment, particularly with potentially UK forces flooding in through the north, means that they're going to be potentially pincered and cut off. And if things are successful, this could cut off the entire German Western Army. As an invasion is launched from the north heading south into occupied Belgium to try and break through, it is not German territory that is necessarily sought here. Yes, there are going to be some grounds that are going to be made in order to be able to try and secure the border and create a bit of a buffer zone, but largely the Dutch are not going to move there, instead moving more into occupied Belgium, and that from that, hopefully they will be able to cut off the entire German Western Army. The likelihood of this, though, is... mixed. Yes, with increasingly greater forces, they will be able to make some movements, and with no large trench systems built up over this, it means that defenses are going to be much lighter than they otherwise would. An immense counterattack by the Germans would likely take place, and this is something that would drastically slow down their advance in the east, as they are forced to divert men from the Eastern Front to the west, which means that the Russians are able to stabilize and hold the line. Does this mean that they are able to break through the south and completely encircle the army? No, that is still likely going to devolve into trench warfare, though it is going to be more fluid here than it was in our own time. Still, inch by grinding inch, land would likely still be taken. as Belgium is slowly reclaimed and Belgian guerrilla forces are then able to rise up against the German Empire, thus bolstering the forces. And there you have it, October of 1915. A breakthrough has been made as a small infantry division of the French finally managed to break through, creating a small encirclement. German forces now in the west are completely caught and taken by surprise. Whether or not this is something that is able to be maintained is entirely up to question. But it looks like that is in fact going to happen. Over the span of the coming weeks, nearly the entire German Western Army is cut off. The surrenders that take place in this time would not just be in the thousands, they would be in the tens of thousands. Hundreds of thousands of forces would be forced to surrender, as the Germans would launch desperate breakthrough attempts in order to be able to try and save their men, but this would be to no avail. With casualties at this point over double what the Entente faces, the Germans simply would not be able to maintain their fronts. By Christmas of 1915, Germany would no longer be in a position to be able to continue the war. So we would then see the Armistice of Compiègne. The Central Powers are not able to effectively fight further. They are asking for an armistice from the Entente, which means that the war is finally over, and the Central Powers have lost. The Great Powers will soon cease the endless gunfire and bloodshed, and a new era has arrived as the political geography changes drastically and the old order is completely shattered. The Great War, which resulted in the deaths of millions of innocent people, has now finally ended. May the dead finally rest in peace. The Entente is victorious, and from this, Russia actually manages to survive. Yes, it would still be an internal chaos as there would still be mass famines, but this means that the Allies would be in a position where they would be able to actually help the Russians to a much greater degree, as by the war ending years earlier, there would be millions of less casualties. Yes, 2.5 million on the side of the Entente and 5 million on behalf of the Central Powers is still a lot, but in comparison to what happened in our own time with the tens of millions, that is not nearly as bad. December 27th, 1915, 2 days after Christmas, peace settles. As peace negotiations drag on, Austria-Hungary would of course naturally collapse, despite being in a arguably better position than they would have been in our own time due to the fact that they did not suffer years of more conflict. The internal stability from having lost a conflict that they begun would just send the entire nation spiraling. As the Hungarians broke away, the Czechoslovaks, the very different Poles, Ukrainians, etc., none of this would be in any kind of real position to be able to be maintained. For their part in the conflict, and in order to be able to extract some concessions as well as monetary reparations from the Germans, the Dutch would be granted a degree of territory. The territory that you see here of the Middle Rhine would likely be placed in their hands, even if only to be able to extract resources from it, even if only to pay back their war debts. The Russians, ironically, in this time would have not only survived, they would have done significantly better, as thanks to the fact that it is the Western Front that ended up proving to be more fluid and the decisive factor in the war rather than the East collapsing, that is something that would give Nikolai a huge amount of prestige. Yes, the Russians would have lost many of the early battles, but after it is that he would go to the front, and this would eventually turn into a stalemate, after which, when German forces are forced to divert to the west, that means that the Russians are able to launch attacks in the east and take back territory themselves, again, earning the monarchy a huge amount of prestige. Thus, from the conflict, they are able to seize the territory of around Constantinople, the very thing that they were promised in the first place, even as the Greeks move in with the Italians to be able to dismantle the Ottomans. So ends the Great War with the Paris Peace Conference. We've arrived at a new age, and largely, things are significantly more peaceful and stable than they were in our own time. Yes, you would have still experienced a lot of hardship within Germany, but not nearly to the same degree as what happened in our own time. In fact, what is crazy is that the Italians also would likely have not seen the rise of Mussolini in this new time period, as with them arguably performing maybe a little bit better, and more importantly with the war ending significantly earlier thanks to the aid of both the Italians and the Dutch being a decisive factor to end the conflict within, say, 6 to 8 months of them joining. That means that Italy would be granted significantly more territory. They would actually be given what it is that they promised, potentially taking large chunks out of Austria, taking some additional territory in the Balkans, which, yes, this would not be as much as they were promised for, say, the coast of Dalmatia, but being given Tyrol would be a huge benefit to them, something that would make them indeed quite happy and the Italian public very proud of themselves. So, with that, my friends, we have the end of today's video. I'm not really sure what else it is that I could talk about over the course of this. Yes, with the fact that the Italians would be significantly stronger because of years less conflict, then maybe this means the Ottomans, even though they were in a rough position and fought out to the very end, they would still be facing so many internal issues and revolts that the state itself would likely collapse as the Italians and Greeks move inwards. That is its own interesting story of what could potentially happen, but I'm not really sure how else it is that we could run with that unless that was a separate scenario. Either way, I think we're going to go ahead and end things here today. Look forward to the next one where I'm going to be diving into the lore of My Little Pony. And with that, my friends, I will see you all next time. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye. Have a good rest of your day.